Welcome to For the Long Run, the podcast exploring the why behind what keeps runners running long, strong, and motivated. I'm your host, Jonathan Levitt. Through personal and professional connections in the running world, I have the privilege of getting to know some amazing athletes. I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspect of running, and this podcast is aimed at exploring this and much more. I hope you enjoy. This podcast is brought to you by BOCO Gear, a Boulder-based custom headwear company named after Boulder, Colorado. BOCO Gear was founded by Kay Martin and born out of her learnings during her more than 25-year career in the outdoor industry. If you've been running trail or ultra races for the last few years, there's a pretty high chance you own a BOCO hat or two. I have almost a dozen of the hats, and they're definitely my favorite headwear. And early in the pandemic, they even started producing high-quality face masks. Check them out at bocogear.com. That's BOCO gear.com. And there's a style for everyone. Make sure to grab 20% off any non-sale item with the code FTLR on their website. Welcome back. I have Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen joining me on the podcast today. Thanks so much for taking some time to chat.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. So we were connected from another podcast with coaches on the run, and so you know Dr. Alex, and we've listened to each other's podcasts and all that fun stuff. So for those who might not know, who is Dr. Kirstin?
Yeah, so I am a chiropractor that's where what my doctorate is in. But I actually have also a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine, and I do more functional medicine and nutrition work than I actually do chiropractic. I live in Portland, Oregon. That's where my practice is. And I predominantly work with athletes. Excuse me. I predominantly work with athletes. We talk a lot about nutrient deficiencies, and it's a lot of what we're going to probably talk about today. But the basics behind looking at like the body from a functional perspective, like everything is connected, right? We don't just want to think about anything just in one, in like isolation. But I'm also a triathlete. I just did a half Ironman in 2019, and I'm currently training for a full Ironman that will hopefully take place this year. Everything was canceled last year, so I also live on a farm, and so that's me.
I love it. It's fun when your passion and educational background overlaps, and you can do all of the fun things in the one day. Your comment on high performance and the fact that everything is intertwined is particularly interesting. I just got off a call with Alicia Montano, and she was talking about how people ask her all the time about being an athlete or about being on a podium and whatnot. And she's like, look, it doesn't matter, what your peak performance is. Everybody should consider themselves high performance athletes because you only have one body, and you should treat it you should treat yourself like you are a high performing athlete because you are, right?
Yes, I love that. And I think anybody who, the first time that I really recognized that was a concept that was very foreign to me, I didn't really realize that we really are athletes, was when I actually started CrossFit over 10 years ago. And they were like, well, do you lift heavy bags of food, like dog food, right? And they're like, well, you're essentially doing like a deadlift, or maybe you're doing like a clean in order to like get that bag out of your car and into your house. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. But then from a different perspective, I've worked with a lot of pregnant women over the years, just being a chiropractor. And I get a lot of questions about nutrition from that perspective. And giving birth is a very athletic feat. So I think that if women and if people in general kind of looked at these different aspects of life as more of an opportunity and just different ways that we can treat our body well, and we can take care of our body and also promote just a healthier body in general. And if we just kind of looked at it like we're all athletes in just different ways, that would be, I think, really helpful for some people just to maybe stay a little bit more active or prioritize a little bit of that time, or maybe work on eating foods that benefit their body that are super nutritious, just different things like that.
Totally. Yeah. I hear all the time from people who think that, or who will say that, oh, I'm not training hard enough to deserve XYZ, and I'm not talking about food, I'm talking about like thinking about themselves as high performing athletes and thinking about recovery and sleep and supplementation and nutrition in a way that somebody who's trying to win at the Olympics would think about these things. And so when somebody comes to you and says, I want to get better or help me, what's generally the first thing that you say to them?
That's a good question. It depends on what they're coming for. So
the answer in nutrition, it depends.
Yes, it's so hard. But I'm going to break this down here into kind of some sections. Okay. So let's say somebody's coming to me because they have like a chronic pain or illness. We could be talking about autoimmune disease here. We could be talking about thyroid issues, which is either hyperthyroid or hypothyroid on their labs, or it could be autoimmune. There's lots of different layers to that. But if a patient or an athlete is coming in with something like that, or they've had chronic knee issues for years, so they're kind of coming to me looking for chiropractic, but clearly there's been some inflammatory pieces going on for a long period of time, we really want to take a step back and just look and see, first off, can we identify what's causing the issue in the first place? Is it nutrition along the lines of, like, if we're looking at thyroid, it's not just about a TSH, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone on a lab. You want to look at T3 and T4, but also what are the factors behind that are the nutrients that are necessary for the body to convert those hormones. So you kind of just always want to be asking a little bit deeper, like why? Let's go even even further, deeper into what might be causing some of these issues. And then a lot of the times you kind of get your answers. Similarly, if somebody's coming with like a chronic knee injury that just doesn't seem to go away and it seems to be inflammatory, is it their movement? Is it movement patterns over time? Is it movement plus nutrition? Are they not really supporting their body outside of their training as well as they could? Really trying, and from that perspective, I'll segue into another type of patient that usually comes to see me, which is they are maybe like me. Like, I would consider myself an age group athlete. I am by no means a pro or elite athlete at all. But maybe they are wanting to accomplish running a 5K or a 10K, and they're doing their first adventures into running. Or maybe they are like me, that they're trying to accomplish this Ironman thing, or an ultra, which is also what my sister-in-law actually really wants to do, an ultra this year. And so we're looking at some races to do together. But maybe they're on that spectrum, and they don't really know beyond training what they need to be doing for their body to optimize recovery and just to make sure that their body doesn't break down over time. So we might be looking there at not just what they're doing as far as like nutrition around their workouts, which is really, really important, but also making sure they're eating enough throughout their day, making sure they're getting enough protein. But then even going further, making sure that they're getting a wide variety of different types of nutrients, looking at sleep, looking at stress management, looking at hydration and water. So lots of different things there, and some of those athletes too have a history. Like, I had an athlete come in that had done a few Ironmans in the past, and he said, I just have had so many problems with cramping. So one of the things that we're making sure to, address with him is not only fluid and electrolyte balance, but also identifying if there's anything else going on underneath the surface there too. And lastly, when I have my kind of pro and elite athletes, sometimes they come to me with some of the issues that I just mentioned, but also sometimes they just come to me and we're looking at making sure we're preventing and doing everything we can to optimize all of those areas so that they can have the best chance, and also really promote performance in all different areas. And so that's kind of what it looks like.
That's a great answer for what people think is a simple question, right?
Yes.
Help me. Okay,
yes.
Here are all these permutations and stipulations. But I think that's the point. I think that's like we're way beyond the one size fits all for anything. If you look at, I see a chiropractor here in Boston, and the work he does on me is wildly different than the work he does on my friends. And even in, different parts of the year, we're focused on different things. Sometimes it's my hips, and sometimes it's my legs, and sometimes it's something else. And it always comes back to the core.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
I'm noticing, but it's always different. And it's the same thing with nutrition, with, what I do through work, which is personalized nutrition through blood testing. And I know you do a lot of micronutrient testing and looking at deficiencies that way. And so the whole idea is, it's 2021. Many people, personalize their training. Why is that the only thing that we're personalizing? And so much so, I don't even think most people are personalizing their training enough.
Yes.
And then you layer the food and recovery and sleep and all that stuff on top of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually reading a book right now, which many people have already read. I'm just a little bit behind. I'm reading Atomic Habits. And one of the things that he talked about in that book is it's all about these like small 1% changes that you can make over time that add up to the biggest outcome in the end. Because we tend to be really focused on like these goals, like, oh, I really want to run a 5K, or, oh, I want to place first in this next Ironman that I'm training for, or this next ultra race, right? It doesn't really matter which part of the spectrum that you're on, but the point being that the more personalized that you can get in your training, the more you can just change those first off, you have to identify where the problems are, right? Like if you're not accomplishing what you're looking for, you kind of need to go back to the drawing board and identify, okay, in your training, is there anything that needs to shift? Like maybe there's some strength in, strength training and mobility, but also stability training that needs to happen there. Or maybe we need to be looking a little bit more into the balance of their training. Similar fashion with nutrition, it also feeds into sleep and recovery and hydration and stress management and all of that. But if you can identify where some of the gaps are, then you can make those 1% changes that over time will help you reach those goals. And so anyway, yeah.
Definitely. And I think the part that is interesting to note there is that the changes that you make for your running or triathlon or whatever it might be, it's not a silo. Like the things that you do to improve performance also improve your life.
Oh, and
so what we've been focusing on is talking to people within the context of, right, like the secret to success in anything. There is no secret, and consistency wins over literally anything else. Unless you take drugs and improve, and then that's not sustainable or legal. So yeah. the only way to get better is to be good consistently, not great frequently, but good consistently. And so doing these things that are fundamental to health allow you to stay healthy and run for longer, or get more out of your sleep every night. And oh, by the way, like you're not training all the time. So if you sleep better and get better recovery for your running, you're going to feel better with your family and your friends and your coworkers and all these things that are not siloed, but you might be doing something to achieve a benefit in one area, and it's going to have tremendous value elsewhere.
Absolutely. That's why people always, they ask me all the time, they're like, well, why are you doing like an Ironman? Like, why would you do that?
I was going to ask that, but it sounds like you're asking yourself. So let's hear it.
Well, yeah. So we're talking right about it, right? Like the idea that when you do some of these different types of like ultra races and these bigger, larger things where you really are kind of pushing your limits and your boundaries, you learn so much about yourself. And just as you mentioned, like it translates into the other areas of your life. Like I run my own practice, I run my own business. And in many ways, the lessons that I learn in both areas, both translate to both areas, right? Like right. The areas where like, I have to learn how to be more consistent, a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Just not just dedicated, but you need to know like your whys. You need to know why you're doing certain things. But you also need to be, I can't, the words eluding me right now. But anyway, you need to be consistent in what you do. Not quite motivation. It's more, it'll come to me later. It's fine. But just being consistent
like
right across the board.
North Star.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, where are you going? But also just making sure that you're doing the things that you need to do every single day, making sure you get onto your bike or get your running done. But when you when you have to get through tasks that you don't necessarily want to do, or like, there's been so many times in many of the races that I've just gotten to a point where I'm like, I can't do this. Like, this is so hard. Like, this is not going well. But then you keep pushing, right? Like, because it really isn't another option. Like, yeah, you could quit, but you don't want to do that. So you kind of have to just keep going. And some people, talk about that as like the 17th or 18th mile in a marathon, or for me, it was a brutal bike. In my half Ironman, I just about lost it. But, I still had to run. I had to get back to my tent, right? I still had to run 13 miles. But, when you get into those places where you're just, you feel like you've hit a limit, and then you overcome that and you keep going, you learn so much about what you're capable of. And then that just translates into business. It translates into life, in your relationships and friendships. So that's kind of why I do it is I'm not necessarily in love with swimming, biking, or running, where, some people are just like, they are runners. They love it. And so they just kind of tolerate the swim and the bike. I'm not really any of them, but I just love that, like, putting yourself in a place where you're not necessarily good at any of those things, but starting to learn what your body can do and push yourself in ways that you just never really thought that you could. And then when you come out on the other side, it's this, you've learned so much about who you are. And that's why I do it.
I love that. So for anyone who's new to the podcast, rewind the last 5 minutes and listen to that again. And that's essentially a summary of the last 140 episodes. And I'm not joking. It's like everything that I've talked about for the last 100 episodes can be summed up in the last 5 minutes there. And I think that's the recipe for success. We talk about knowing your why. That's the intent of this podcast. We talk about understanding where motivation comes from when it's waning, or what to do when you don't feel good. And then the extrapolation of these lessons from the road and trails and whatever into life. And there's so much crossover. I just had a conversation with the founder of BOCO Gear, Kay Martin, and she talked about the last 25 years of experience in the industry and dealing with hard times and being presented with a global pandemic that shut down her supply chain. And as a result, they pivoted, and, she has 24,000 new customers as a result in a way that she never would have imagined. And these things that we learn about resiliency from running are so relevant to life. One thing that you said that particularly resonated was there's no other option sometimes. Sometimes there is. And
Sure.
Like in a race, you can walk off the course and you can choose to stop. First, once you start doing that, it's very hard to stop doing that and not do it again. But it's empowering. And I had a conversation with Devin Yanko about she's a very amazing trail and ultra and marathon runner and has raced every distance from 5K to 100 miles. And she experienced abuse in high school from a basketball coach. And what she loves about endurance and extreme endurance events is that she controls the pain, and you can turn it off at any time, and that's empowering. And that's the piece that I think is so critical. And there's plenty of science that supports that endurance athletes make the best employees. I'm not just saying that because I am one of them, but I completely agree. And again, it's just an affirmation that what we're doing, people say all the time, like, oh, it's just running. It's like, no, it's not. If it's just running, you're missing so much more in a way that it can enrich your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Sometimes the option you need to take is to just not do it anymore. You're totally right. You do have options. You always do. But a lot of, the situations that, I kind of get myself into is just where my mind is sort of playing games with me, right? Like it just doesn't you just don't really want to go any further. You don't have any injuries. You don't have any pains. Like you're fine. It's just hard. Right. And so it's getting into that scenario. But of course, like, if something is not going right and it's not going well, and you are at risk of potentially creating injuries that you'll have to work on for a while, then yeah, there's obviously an option to walk off the course. But I was more referencing that sometimes the option is you need to not just give in to your mind, right? You need to just keep going, and then it's amazing what you can get out on the other side. Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes there is no option.
Yeah.
I chose to do something where the option was a very expensive helicopter ride or you finished.
Ooh, yeah.
So I did rim to rim in the fall of 2019, and my longest run to date was a 50K. And by the time I got to the North Rim, it was like 22 miles, and it took me as long as it took to run that 50K. So every step I took, descending the North Rim, going back to the South Rim, was the longest time I'd ever spent on my feet, and I needed to double that. And it was such a mind fuck because it was like, I've never done this. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I can do this, and I don't have a choice but to do it.
Yep. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And I think there's so much that you learn about yourself, right, in those scenarios where you're just like, I have to keep moving forward, right, whether I have to crawl myself out of here. Like there are no other choices. But you also learn a lot about yourself because you also accomplished it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
I took a video of myself climbing the last 5K out of the canyon. So the last 6 miles is straight uphill, and you climb, I don't know, 6,000 feet in those 5 or 6 miles. And
brutal.
Yeah. It took me like 2 hours to go 5K.
Yeah.
And I took a video of myself, basically saying, I was taking these videos because about 10 miles prior, I was feeling on top of the world, and I took video there so I could remember that moment of like, what is pure bliss running 7-minute mile pace at the 50K and just like being so high on life and adrenaline, to fast forward 10 miles and I'm 40 miles in and I can barely walk. And I take this video and it's like, I think the line I said was, at this point, there's no choice but to keep going. Just keep moving. And that's all there is to it. And I was like, I watched it later. I was like, oh my God, I was so delirious, like 11 or 12 hours in. But it was right. And it's like, sure, I wasn't going to die. I wasn't, I was 3 miles away from the road. Or I could just go downhill if something happened. No pun intended. But it was like in that moment, I was like, I'm going to persevere. I'm going to push through this. And then anything else that's hard becomes easier because you've done something that was the most pain I've ever been in. And the biggest physical challenge and mental challenge I'd ever experienced. And these are the things that level us up so that the next time we're presented with something, it's easier or it's more attainable.
I love it. Yep. That's it. Once you do it once, you start chasing that again. You know what I mean? Like, think that's why it like starts with something. Like my first half marathon that I ever did, I had barely run more than 6 miles preparing for it. And I remember getting to mile 12 and it was only a mile left. And I just was like, this is the longest mile that I've ever run. And you know, you once you get to that finish line, you're like, okay, all right, I did it. I made it. This is this is the longest I've ever run before in my life. And then it just starts to kind of get under your skin. You know, you start looking at what are some of the other options, you know, and then it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then you start really kind of pushing your boundaries on what you think you can do. But, you know, that's the coolest thing.
For sure. So why did you go for your first run?
For the first half marathon?
Nope. First run.
Oh, okay. So I have never really been a runner. So let's see. I played a lot of different sports. I grew up doing gymnastics. I played soccer, which I guess you do a lot of running in soccer, but I never considered that like running. You know, there was a reason, there was a purpose you were running, right? To get to the ball, to move the ball, it was just different. And then I played volleyball, and I remember like we would run, you know, a couple of miles here and there, and I just hated it. Like track and cross country was definitely not one of my choice sports. But then I got out of high school after playing volleyball, and I, you know, was also very active. I loved to snowboard. I loved wakeboarding. I liked, you know, all those different types of sports. But I got into college, and I didn't really have anything to do because I wasn't playing college sports. So my sister got me into CrossFit, and then CrossFit was where I really started having to run like 400 meters multiple times. And then, you know, starting to run more like a mile in a workout. And I started actually becoming.
And that was far, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Like I would barely run the 200 or 400 meters. Like sometimes I would stop and walk because I was also so exhausted from the other things that you were doing. But,
right.
You know, looking back at that, my fitness has changed so much, right, over the last like 12 years. But, yeah, so like running 400 meters or like running a mile was so far. But then I was at a different CrossFit gym later on, and the gym was doing it. They wanted to go and do the Leavenworth half marathon in Washington. And I was like, well, I love Leavenworth and the gym's doing it. So my friends are doing it. Why don't I go and just give this a try? So I started, you know, running a little bit more on top of my CrossFit workouts that I'd go and do. And my parents have this like gorgeous trail right by their house, and I was living with them at the time. And so I ran. I would just go and run that, you know, 6 miles. And I remember they have this super duper high or super duper long hill. It's straight up pretty much. And when we would bike it as kids with them, there were times that we'd have to get off and walk. It's that steep. And I just remember the first time my dad was on his bike and I was running, and I ended up being able to run the whole hill. And I was like, okay, like this is getting better. We're getting it. We're getting it. So then from that 6 miles that I just trained, I hopped into that half marathon. And then from there, that's when things just sort of went uphill or downhill, depending on how you want to look at it. But I became more of a runner right after that.
2020 was all about adapting as runners and also in every other aspect of life. As a sponsor of this episode, I'm proud to highlight BOCO Gear's face masks, which are a perfect complement to their hats and other headwear. Offering a double layer with a slot for a filter, these masks will help keep you and your community safer in these trying times. With dozens of styles available online, there's an option for everyone. Check them out at bocogear.com and please wear a mask. And now back to our conversation.
Okay, so after that, I just continued doing CrossFit. And right around that time is when I started going to chiropractic school. And my friends were like, hey, and I was still kind of doing CrossFit at the time, but when you're in school for almost 12 hours a day, it's really hard to also train and work out. So, you know, I'd fit it in where I could. so my friends were like, hey, like, let's go and run this Bridge of the Gods half marathon. It's in Portland and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous run. And I was like, sure, I've done one before. I was fine. Let's do it. Needless to say, I still wasn't running a whole lot, right? I was doing CrossFit, not running a whole lot. So I jumped into this half marathon pretty much untrained, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea because I didn't have the tissue resiliency built up. And at the time, I had no idea what that even was, to be perfectly honest. I know more now. But anyway, so I get into this run and it is basically hills. And for anybody who's done that before, you know that, yeah, climbing the hills isn't so bad, but a lot of the damage is done when you're coming downhill. So I ended up, and there's stairs at the end of this. And those stairs, I thought I was going to have to sit on my bum and make my way down the stairs on my bum because my knees and my hips hurt so bad by the end of it. I was essentially limping. And I ended up with 2 meniscus injuries and a right hip inflamed bursa. So I was limping around campus for like a week or two, going into the, student clinic, getting treatment, all that. But I learned a valuable lesson there, which is tissue resiliency is a really big deal. I also learned how to treat meniscus and hip injuries from running, which was also good. But at the same time, I also learned if you're going to run and if you're going to run these distances, you need to make sure that you're trained and that you continue running. So from there, after that, my dad was like, hey, because he had seen the Ironman in Kona one year when he was working out there on a job site, and he was like, "Hey, we should look at doing this." And I was like, "You are crazy." So that's and honestly, after that, once I started looking into it more, that kind of got under my skin. He was like, "Hey, do you want to try this mock triathlon thing that Portland Triathlon Club does?" And then from there, it was just, that was it. I said at the end of that one, I was like, I'm never doing this again. Triathlons are not for me. I had a panic attack in the water because it was so cold. It was kind of a monster of a day, but I also started just kind of realizing like there's a whole world out here beyond what I've already done in, half marathons. And that's it. It just went from there. I started looking at other triathlons. I started looking at, half Ironmans and just been chipping away, at it. And training is anywhere now I have a knee thing going on right now, so I'm not running a whole lot. I'm doing a lot more cycling, and then our pools and gyms are all closed down, so I'm not swimming a whole lot either. But running ranges from anywhere between 4 to 7 miles per workout. So usually I'm doing that 3 or 4 times a week. But yeah, that's what it kind of looks like now.
Very cool. Where do you envision your endurance goals in the next 5 to 10 years?
Once you get into it, it starts opening up all the doors, right? So as I mentioned, my sister-in-law really wants to do a one after this. So just looking for different races that would be interesting to do. And then also, though, I think it's location based. I always like to see if I can travel somewhere and do something in a place where I'd really like to go. I'd love to do a Ragnar race. I'd love to do at least tackle an endurance run, like 50K. And then I don't know. See, this is where it starts, right? It's like, I don't know if I could do 100K race, but once you start wondering if you can,
right, then you do it. Then you're sold.
It goes, Yeah. So, yep, it's just chipping away, right? I've never actually run a full marathon before, but I'm about to run a full marathon at the end of my Ironman. So I'll kind of chip away at both of those at the same time. And then, from there, it's just, once you know you can do that, you can do the next. So there will probably be a 50K that we'll do this year. And then, then it's just what's next. Mm-hmm.
I love that. How does your own educational background translate into what you do for yourself athletically?
I have good and bad days. So don't, I hope that anybody listening to this, I hope that everybody listening to this isn't like, oh my gosh, she must know all the things to do and she must do all the things. I wish I was better sometimes at it, but also keep in mind, like, I, as I said before, like I run a business. So there's a lot of what I do is to keep myself fit. And it's just things in different ways that I push myself to keep myself fit. But at the same time, like a lot of my focus and a lot of my time goes into keeping my business going. So sometimes I find that I get done with a work day and I barely drank a drop of water. And that is a bad day when that happens. But just you learn right along the journey. So part of what my educational background kind of gives me is when I have something pop up, like for example, my knee is popping right now and I have swelling in the back of my knee, which is probably part of it is the popliteus muscle. So I can diagnose a lot of the things that are going on very quickly. So I know when I can like push myself. I know when I need to slow down. I know how to kind of shift and change my workouts accordingly. And I know how to talk to my coach about that as well. But also, I try very hard to prioritize getting my like mobility and stability training done, because I know that part of the reason why my knee thing popped up this round is because a little bit stressed right now because of some of the things that are going on with work and stuff like that. But I also know that I always have things that I need to work on with my knees as far as stability goes. So just changing up my training so that I have more strength specific and stability building exercises in those strength workouts is very good for me as far as how my body works and how I need to do that for my knees. And I know at least where to start on a lot of those because I also treat them. But I also do sometimes my own soft tissue work. I also know when I need to go and get a massage therapist to work it all out. And I try to prioritize getting, that sort of physical care in at least once a week, once every other week. So, it's like those things that I just inherently just know I have to do because it's what I know, right? Like I've been educated in it. But then on top of that too, when we start to kind of look at nutrition, I never really realized it until one of my friends was like, she started asking me all of these questions and I was like, well, I just know. And she's like, why? Like, how do you know that? I'm just like, I just know that I need to do that, and she said, well, is it Dr. K approved? So she starts like looking at all these different like products and these different things. And she's like, well, what about this or what about this? And I just know how to read a list of ingredients, right, on the back of on the back of a package. And if I just see certain things, I'm like, nope, that goes right back. Like I walk down the Costco aisles and I'm just looking left and right. And I'm like, nope, because I know what's already going to be, like in those foods, or I've looked at them before and I just have a filter because I know background wise, like just different types of oils, different types of fats we want to avoid, different types of like colorings and dyes that I don't want to have in my diet. I know what's going to potentially be more inflammatory because it's, maybe fairly processed, there's just pieces like that. But then on the flip side as well, when you're walking down a produce aisle, I'm also looking at what different colorful foods did I have last week that we need to now switch up and have these different colorful foods this week? What are some things that we've been having maybe a little bit too much of, and what do we need to, bring in as far as variety goes, so that I make sure we're getting that wide variety of different types of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. And then on top of that, even further, a story I tell when I get into kind of nutrient deficiencies is prior to my half Ironman, I was kind of working myself up and it was only a couple of months before my half Ironman, but I did a squat workout that literally destroyed me. I could not recover. My muscles were ropes. I did everything I could possibly think of and I just couldn't figure it out. So I got a lab. And so see, again, like I just knew what I needed to do, right? So I pulled a lab and I looked at all my blood levels of all my nutrients. And I didn't waste time, I think is a piece of that. I just knew I needed to look a little bit deeper. So I pulled that lab, found out that I was not only like deficient, I was very, very, very deficient in vitamin D, like in the teens. And one of the things that people don't always know is that vitamin D is essential for muscle recovery, not just, protein and all that, but there's a lot of other vitamins and minerals that are essential for maintaining optimal muscle health and strength. So I quickly loaded up on the vitamin D in high amounts, so I could get those levels up as fast as possible. And I ended up completing my half Ironman with no injuries. I was totally fine. I was able, obviously, to train, continually up until that point. And I was back in the gym, ready to train later that week. So that's kind of why and how my background tends to influence what I do and how I train and how I work things out. So does that answer your question?
It does, yes. And let's talk more about vitamin D. Why should everybody care about it right now?
Okay, so vitamin D has several different uses in the body, and I think we're still discovering more. But vitamin D is something that I mentioned is really essential for muscle recovery, but it's also a big component of bone health. So if you're looking at like an athlete that maybe has frequent stress fractures or has some signs that their bone density and bone health needs some work, vitamin D is going to be a big one to look at, as well as your calcium and magnesium. But everybody always knows calcium, right? But they don't always hear vitamin D. The other thing that vitamin D is essential for is your immune system. So another one
important these days.
So important these days. And actually prior to when like March, right, when in 2020, when COVID was starting to kind of come out, and I'm not going to dive into this too much because it's sort of a sensitive topic, I think, in some ways, but there's been several studies in the past that have looked at vitamin D as far as its role that it plays with viruses and also how it affects and works with respiratory infections, so lung infections. And it's interesting because vitamin D does have a regulatory role with how your immune system fights and takes care of viruses. So vitamin D levels are just one of those things that, I put out to my email list back in March. I was like, hey guys, you might want to think about making sure you have enough vitamin D. Turns out now we're seeing all the other studies coming out that, oh, hey, your vitamin D levels could probably affect your response to COVID. So there's, it's just looking back at like basic physiology, like what does the body need? What are the building blocks of how each of these systems function, and what in each of those areas is essential? And then on another factor for vitamin D, since I live in the Pacific Northwest where we don't see the sun very often, we also see a lot of SADS, right? Seasonal affective disorder. So that's essentially where, towards January, February, when we haven't seen the sun for a while, people tend to get a little bit kind of depressed and feel kind of down and unmotivated and all those things. And a lot of the times what we look at is vitamin D, because we only see the sun and we only can absorb vitamin D from the sun from like June to October, I think, with how far the sun is away from where we are in our latitude. So it's not just about being outside, which being outside has its own benefits for sure. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't just go outside because you're not going to absorb the vitamin D from the sun in the winter. But at the same time, you're only going to absorb vitamin D for a certain period of time in the year. For us, right? It's going to be different for other areas of the world. But for where we are, it's only a certain amount of time. So supplementing with things like vitamin D can help prevent that kind of seasonal affective. They call it disorder, but I don't like the word disorder, but it's SADS. So it helps to prevent that as well.
A very succinct and helpful recap there.
I try.
Let's talk about another biomarker that
Okay.
I think that this audience should be aware of. Talk to me about iron and ferritin and the difference between the two, and why are so many women low?
Oh, okay. So when we're looking at iron and then when we're looking at ferritin, so part of the difference is in how it's it's active in the body. So that's a piece of it, but it's also how we test for it. So we don't just necessarily want to test for iron. We really want to test for free ferritin, because that kind of gives us an idea of how much is in the body and how much is kind of like unbound in a sense. So if it's like super duper low, that gives you a better, like free ferritin is very, very low in the body. That means that it doesn't have a whole lot to use and go off of. So that's just, and you can, anyway, I know that you also work a lot with these as well. So you can pipe in and chime in anytime. But on top of that as well, iron, especially for women, speaking of ferritin, so iron is one of those things that you absolutely have to have. It correlates and works a lot with how we bind oxygen with our blood. So hemoglobin and heme and looking at all those pieces, not only is iron necessary for ensuring that your red blood cells are able to bind oxygen, but also vitamin B12 is essential for that too. So you're going to start to see, as you start looking at iron and all these different types of vitamins and minerals, there's also some correlations in between there that they can work in conjunction with each other. Similarly, if you're looking at taking an iron supplement because you're deficient, vitamin C is really helpful for boosting iron levels because it helps your body absorb it a little bit better. So it's looking for like correcting things. Vitamin C, looking for supplements and looking at the back of them anyway, making sure you get that with vitamin C can be really helpful. There's also different types of iron that you can see in different supplements that are better or worse as far as like absorbing goes. So absorbing through your gut, right? So some are going to be easier to absorb, some are going to be harder to absorb, but they sometimes all play different roles. Now, even diving further into this, women typically have issues with iron because an iron deficiency, because we bleed. We have menstrual cycles every month. So we lose iron through the blood that we lose. And so not if you aren't, and this also can come down to the diets as well. So different types of, if you're a vegan or vegetarian and you don't eat meat is going to be one of your largest sources for getting iron. So making sure that you track those. This is the thing that I love about blood tests, and I love about now that these labs are being able to, like, people are being able to order their own labs at this point. I'm going to get on a soapbox for just a second and then I'll come back to iron. But one of the things I always get so frustrated with is that I love for people to be able to use their insurance and be able to order labs when they need them. The problem though is that if sometimes, I'm not harping on everybody, but sometimes when I send people in to get these labs ordered so that their insurance will hopefully cover it, they sometimes are met with resistance. Like, well, why would you need to get that ordered? Why would you need to order B12? Why would you need to order iron? And I give my patients the slew of reasons of why they would need to do that. Right. But at the same time, sometimes they're still met with resistance because it just doesn't seem like it's necessary. But having a baseline of where you're at really helps, because if something goes wrong, you know what to look back on. And then you also can order that lab again and see if there are any changes. And if I could have every athlete run basic labs that give them a fairly good baseline to work off of all their vitamins and mineral levels, their cholesterol, which includes like LDL, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides. If you can look at all of those things, if you can also look at, as I said, iron and free ferritin, if you can also look at B12, if you can look at any other B vitamins, that would be awesome as well. Any other antioxidant levels, CoQ10, things like that. There's so many that you can look at. But if we can get a baseline, it makes it so much easier when things don't quite go right to figure out what's going on. But also, if you catch something, then you can catch it ahead of time before it becomes a problem. So anyway, I love that people are being able to order these labs without necessarily needing to go through a doctor sometimes, because you can just get them for yourself. And that is it is biohacking 101. Know what's going on underneath the surface so you can actually see how your body's functioning. Okay, I digress.
Absolutely, you are preaching to the choir. The number of times that I've heard somebody say that they tried to ask their physician, and their physician said, "You're not at risk for this," or "Don't worry about it." It's like that's not the point. That good health is not the absence of disease.
Yes, it drives me nuts.
So there was a study done in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, and now I think it was 2016. I used to say last year, but I'm realizing that was 5 years ago. I'll have to double check that. But anyway, it identified a handful of these biomarkers that are critical for measuring, and when it's critical to measure them, and the some of the call outs were when you feel good and when you feel bad, because isn't it useful to know what good feels like or looks like objectively? And then if you feel bad, that's another time. What is the reason for why you feel bad? We worked with an athlete who came to us with a ferritin level of 6. She did an Instagram takeover for us, so I can actually share her data. It's Rhea Coble. She's a professional, or she's a Spartan athlete and obstacle course racer and long distance athlete. She was running 100 miles a week with a ferritin level of 6, and she was exhausted all the time. And she just thought that it was like, all right, I run a lot, so I'm tired. She got it up a lot, and she's like, this is fantastic. I actually have energy to do all these things. And it's so sad that people are sort of like pigeonholed into this feeling that, oh, it's just normal because this is what I do, without having any sort of objective assessment of why. And it's very validating when you feel bad, and then there's a reason for why you feel bad.
Yes. Just recently, I had a patient come to me for weight loss. I promise we'll get back to the iron thing, but I had a patient come to me for weight loss, and I said, okay, but she had all these other symptoms, right? She had like headaches. She had these kind of like overall aches. She wasn't being able to lose weight, and she was super duper bloated, like so bloated. And I was like, I would really like to just run a gut panel and just see what's happening. Cause she had like, sometimes she would get bloated because of certain foods. She would get constipation every once in a while that would just flare up for no reason. And I was like, I just really want to look a little bit further into that. Well, it turns out she actually had a very blatant inflammatory response to gluten that showed up as part of what we found on the labs. And so we cut gluten out. And within a week, she had dropped 5 pounds. And I'm not talking about weight loss necessarily, but the point being, she also lost 4 inches off of her waist, which over about, I think, 2 or 3 months of finally getting gluten out of her diet. And the point is that sometimes, and she didn't even know how bad she felt until we cut it out, just the other day, until after. And so we wrapped up her program just the other day, and she was like, I had no idea. She's like, I didn't
know
reach
what you
my
can feel. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. She's like, I didn't reach my goal weight, but I've lost so many inches off of my belly. Like, I am so excited about that. And she was just talking about wanting to go and run potentially a marathon, I think, later this year. And that's the point, right? Is that sometimes you don't exactly know what the problem, that you could feel better. Right. You don't always know. But if there's something that's just not right, or if you want to just just look, just order the labs, look and see where you're at. And then if something is found and you fix it and you feel better, well, that's a win-win. So going back to iron just really quickly here, just because you have you don't necessarily have to have iron deficiency anemia for there to be an iron deficiency. So when I also talk about nutrient deficiencies, I like to give an example, which I use actually vitamin D as the example for this one, where we can have optimal levels for you specifically. You can have insufficiency, and then you can have an outright deficiency. So like optimal levels for vitamin D are going to range anywhere between like 50 to 80 on normal scales. But then you can have anywhere between 20 to 40 on your labs, which we would kind of run as an insufficiency. And then if it's anywhere lower than that, that's an outright deficiency that you need, that you're going to have quite a bit higher supplements for a while levels until you can get those levels back up. But the reason why there's a range is because certain people are going to function a lot better in that 50 range, and some people are going to function a lot better in that 80 range. So that's like this sliding scale that we can kind of look at. And the same thing happens with iron. So we can have lower levels of iron that aren't necessarily out of normal range. But if you have things like cold or pale hands, if you have brittle nails or kind of brittle hair, if you are feeling kind of fatigued and not really like you have a lot of energy, those are all symptoms that somebody can look at and then run a panel and be able to correlate for you, because it makes sense. If you have lower levels of iron, they might still be in normal range, but it might be worth maybe just upping that a little bit and just seeing if that helps you out. So those are kind of things, but not just women are at risk of that. Men, people in general, but men tend to lose a lot of iron through their sweat. So for people who are like heavy sweaters, they can also be at risk of iron deficiency if they're not getting it enough through food. So yeah.
That all makes sense. Switching gears back over to you. What is one thing, and thank you for the very succinct and helpful wrap up of two of the statistically most relevant and most necessary things to focus on if sleep, energy, and performance are a goal, which I think it is for most. So thank you for that. I think my last question is around how do you sort of alluded to this a little bit, but how do you balance the fact that what you do is so connected and intertwined with your passions, and work is play, is work, is, it's a big overlap. Do you find it hard to turn it off sometimes? Is it something you're good at? What's your relationship with work and life?
That's a good question. Okay. Well, yeah. So I find it hard to turn it off sometimes. I mean, part of why I do what I do is because I see quickly. One of the reasons why I started looking a lot deeper into nutrient deficiencies is because similarly, I saw an Ironman athlete years ago that had won several of her events. So she was going to Kona earlier in the year, but then I saw as the year went on, she sort of started to tank and didn't really give a whole lot of reasons why until towards the end. And she was like, yeah, so I got sick. I had iron deficiency, all of that. And it wasn't caught soon enough. So then Kona came and she had she didn't finish. She had to drop out in the middle. And seeing that process unfurl in my personal social media world, right? This is where my work and business tend to sort of overlap. I started recognizing like, okay, this is a passion of mine to do this for myself. I like to be in the endurance world. I like to push myself. I like to, explore different realms here. But I'm also seeing so many issues at the same time in this world that I know how to fix. And so, yeah, sometimes it is really hard to separate the two, but it also makes it sort of feel like I'm not ever really working either. You know what I mean? Like there's some aspects of business that are hard to tackle and they just are brutal and it sucks. But then there's the other side where you see these athletes that get better, right? And they're improving and they are able to achieve these incredible things. And you played maybe a small portion or role in that, in that outcome, but knowing that that athlete was able to do what they were able to do because in some way, shape, or form, you were able to kind of push them in that direction and just optimize what they already had inside themselves. You just give that little push. That's like one of the coolest feelings. So yeah, sometimes it feels like work isn't really work. And then other days, it all is just really hard. I think overall, you just don't really feel like you're necessarily going to work. You just get to do what you like to do.
Totally agree. If we want to follow along with your adventures or the information you're putting out, where can we find you on social?
Yeah, at Dr. Kirstin. So DrKirstin is the great place to find me on both Instagram and Facebook. And then, that's the best place.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to chat, and hope to see you out there at some point.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today's episode. Like many long runs, it's sad when it has to end. I hope you join in next week on For the Long Run. And in the meantime, happy trails. If you've enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot to me if you shared it so that others can find it and enjoy it too.